Welcome to Emily's Garden, come on out today. Welcome to Emily's Garden, just a snap away. In this place, life is celebrated. It's the place where dreams are cultivated. Welcome to Emily's Garden, just a snap away.
My name is Emily. Welcome to my garden. It's a place where dreams are cultivated. I have another great show planned for you today. Weather plays a dramatic role in all of our lives in one way or another at times. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, commonly known as NOAA, is a scientific agency within the United States Department of Commerce. The National Weather Service has maintained a river and stream gauge program since its inception in 1870. In 1993, a new facility was built locally. The Northeast River Forecast Center is co-located with the Taunton Weather Forecast Office. Join me for another visit to NOAA in this series of weather-related episodes.
We provide our forecast services to the weather offices to support their flood warning program. So we're sort of the modeling center that supports that aspect of what they do. The Weather Forecast Office areas are much smaller, and where they provide their services is really governed by how far out the Doppler weather radar can detect severe weather signals for tornadoes, for high wind, for hail and flash flooding. So the weather offices have the task of providing the day-to-day forecast, working with the local emergency managers, the state directors of emergency management, and other partners, including the media, on a day-to-day basis. My river center is looking at things at a regional scale, dealing with our regional and local water partners, such as the different water bureaus, water departments, partner agencies like the Corps of Engineers, and so on.
And everything is all housed in this one building.
All in this one building.
You know, I have heard so much about the Doppler weather radar, and it's here?
Oh yes, it's right across the street. Make sure to take a picture of it before you go home. The Doppler weather radar, that technology actually goes back to the early 1970s, believe it or not. But we didn't see it mature and become a full operational radar warning system until the late 1980s. And then it took over 10 years to deploy the radars across the nation, which led to the modernization of the National Weather Service. The Doppler weather radar, the whole concept there is that beyond being able to see precipitation in the atmosphere, it's also able to detect the wind. If you think of standing at an intersection where a train's coming by, you'll hear the pitch will be, increasing as it comes toward you, and then you'll hear the pitch drop as the train moves away from you. That's the Doppler shift, because as the parcels are coming toward you, it's transmitting itself at one frequency, and as it moves away, it's at another. The radar is able to detect that signal shift and basically equate it to wind in the atmosphere.
The National Weather Service operates a nationwide network of Doppler weather radars that can now detect the lightest precipitation and velocities. The National Weather Service maintains a network of weather radars providing invaluable data for forecasting all types of weather conditions. The Doppler dome, sometimes called a radome, is simply a structural cover used to protect an antenna from the effects of environmental exposure. In fact, the word is simply a combination of the words radar and dome. The radome greatly reduces wind load in ice and rain conditions. NexRad, or Next Generation Radar, obtains weather information of precipitation and wind based upon returned energy. If energy strikes an object like a raindrop, bird, or even a bug, the energy is scattered in all directions, and a small fraction of that scattered energy is directed back toward the radar. The radar receives the reflected signal during its listening period. Computers analyze the strength of the return pulse and the time it took to travel to the object and back, as well as the phase shift of the pulse. The Doppler effect was named after the Austrian physicist Christian Doppler, who discovered it. Most have likely experienced the Doppler effect around trains. You see, as a train passes your location, the pitch in the train's whistle changes from high to low. But as the train approaches, the sound waves that make up the whistle are compressed, making the pitch higher. And as the train moves away from you, the sound waves are stretched, lowering the pitch. The same effect takes place in the atmosphere as a pulse of energy from NEXRAD strikes an object and is reflected back toward the radar.
I am a hydrologist in charge of the Northeast River Forecast Center. So I run a very unique center. There are 13 river centers in the nation, and our primary purpose is to model our rivers and streams and provide forecasts for the protection of life and property when it comes to folks living along the rivers in the region. My forecast area stretches from western New York, the Buffalo Creeks, all the way to eastern Maine, and we actually do forecasting as well for our colleagues in Canada. The Richelieu River in Quebec province and the St. John River, which forms the border with Maine in New Brunswick province.
Amazing. How did you get involved with anything like this? I mean, for a child going to school, how did you get
Oh, that's easy.
Okay.
That's an easy question to answer. You will find many of us meteorologists, which I am by degree, were bitten very early in our years. For me, it was Hurricane Belle. August of 1976.
Ma Belle.
Ma Belle. We had just moved to West Warwick. My mom still lives up on the hill near the West Warwick High School. Great place to grow up as a meteorologist because I was up above everybody else and I had a wide open view to the east. Belle came up knocking down power, dropping a couple of inches of rain, and I was fascinated by the satellite pictures and watching this buzzsaw move up the East Coast. My dad was a science teacher at the Deering Junior High School, and he could tell I had an interest in this stuff. That weekend, when the storm was over, my grandparents came up from Westgate Village, just a few minutes away. And out of the trunk of my grandfather's 73 Oldsmobile comes the 1938 hurricane book from the Providence Journal. And that has become my weather Bible, because that, I think, hooked me in the field. It was solidified by the blizzard in 1978, which I think you'll find a lot of other meteorologists in New England that grew up in the area. That was probably their marquee storm. But to me, it was Hurricane Belle, and I have spent a good chunk of my career in the last 27 years studying the behavior of our New England hurricanes. And they're a very unique beast. They're devastating. They're low frequency, but they're high impact. We don't get the big ones all the time, but boy, you better know what you're in for. As I got into the Weather Service, a couple of the papers that I wrote dealt with New England hurricane behavior for emergency managers and dealt with the whole behavior of our hurricanes. And I spent 8 years working with researchers out at the State University of New York in Albany on that very topic, understanding the unique behavior of our hurricanes from an acceleration standpoint, because they're moving like freight trains when they get up here, but also in that transition that happens when they get to our latitude. They're trying to become a winter storm. So they go from this tropical buzzsaw to this really elongated monster of a system with all of the wind on the east side and this remarkable amount of rainfall on the west side. And Irene was a classic New England hurricane in 2011 with lots of wind damage and power outages over Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts and remarkable rainfall over western New England and eastern New York, which devastated parts of the Hudson Valley, the Deerfield Basin, and especially the Schoharie Creek and Prattsville in that area.
And I have to mention, as we're speaking, we have a mutual friend here, Jim Corbin, who is also a meteorologist. Similar background. How did you get started?
Same college of graduation, too, Linden State.
Linden State. My thing, I think, was what I remember back, and I do remember Hurricane Belle. I was living in Braintree. That's where I grew up, and just south of Boston. But I do think, and that was 76, right? Yep. 78, I think, was the thing that really got it for me, like many. If we're all roughly the same age, and I think, Dave, you'd agree about that.
And I'd say there'd never been another blizzard like it.
I think everyone in New England knows the blizzard of 78 for sure.
And it's not just the storm itself that got me, but the fact that I almost was stranded. My father was stranded for 2 days. He had abandoned his car on Route 128, so he was one of the ones that had to walk about a mile to the Holiday Inn there in Randolph, or whatever it was. And so I was so fast, I thought my father was going to die and things like that. So I was so fascinated with that storm, and it was my first anemometer, and it didn't have a gust recorder, but I remember seeing it gust to 80 miles an hour, and we were not exactly in an exposed area, and I thought, wow, this is wild. And that's one of the main reasons I get into weather, just like you with Hurricane Belle and stuff. And even though Belle grew up on an exposed spot, that's probably, had you probably been living, Dave, probably in a lower spot, maybe it might not have been as
Yeah,
impressive
it might
to
have.
you.
Yeah, because that one was really more about the rainfall than anything else. We had lost power for a couple of hours during the overnight. But I think it was more my grandfather giving me that book in the 30th hurricane, because I have spent a good chunk of my career now walking those same beaches, taking what I like to call my next set of before pictures. And unfortunately, in 2012, I had another religious experience when I went down to Misquamicut 2 days after, with the help of Rhode Island Emergency Management, getting me in there with the National Guard. And I was just amazed at the amount of damage that South Coast saw from a relatively weak system when you compare its intensity to 38. But boy, oh boy, that coastline, we've lost a lot of beachfront in 70 years. We haven't had the experience of going through a big hurricane.
Let me ask you, if Sandy had taken the left hook 150 miles further north, what would it have been like around this area, southeastern Mass, Rhode Island?
I think
most of the,
Yeah.
Providence.
The Winfield aside, what Sandy was, with respect to wind, not a Category 3 hurricane, but Sandy was producing seas offshore comparable to a 1938 hurricane. We had buoy reports of over 40-foot seas south of Block Island, and we so rarely see that. If she had taken that left and maybe came in, say, near Mystic, Connecticut, we would have had, I think, easily Category 3 inundation. We would have seen coastal damage and inundation that would have been comparable to Carol in '54. I'm convinced of it. Whether or not we would have driven that far up the bay, not sure, because the perfect track for Narragansett Bay to get hit is one system moving due north. Because in all of the components of motion, the wind, the ocean water, everything is going south to north.
Yeah.
And for Buzzards Bay, it's actually a system moving north-northeast, something along the lines of a Hurricane Bob, but a little bit farther west, where that core of wind, instead of going over Cape Cod, goes right up Buzzards Bay.
Now, there is such thing, though, again, as hurricanes doing good for replenishing, if you were in somewhat of a dry stretch, right? I mean, there are some goods that water from hurricanes can do.
I would say Arthur this past July was a good tropical system. We needed the rain, put down 6 to 8 inches of rain. Unfortunately, it flooded the daylights out of the infrastructure of New Bedford. But that happens with urban flash flooding in high intense rainfall events. But that was sort of a good hurricane. Irene took it to task. Irene was a little too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot too much of a good thing.
And as I'm listening to you, I can't not help but feel even more awe for Mother Nature.
It is amazing.
With all of the knowledge that you have, what is it that you do when you find that there is a storm? What is your next mode of action?
Our process actually starts more than a week in advance. We take a lot of effort to step up the level of situational awareness, is what we call it, with our water partners from my office and with the weather office, with the state and local emergency managers, putting out information through briefings and PowerPoint slides and through our products that we issue 5 to 7 days in advance to begin to get people to recognize, hey, you know what, we've got a fairly robust system coming at us. And the amount and level of detail we put in is really a function of the type of system we're dealing with.
I'm sure that you've seen some tremendous changes in the weather, and you were showing me a chart a little while ago. What is this one all about?
This particular chart is an index we use to monitor wet and dry conditions. It's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. In this particular graphic, we're studying it from 1930 to 2013. And what this really represents is just how much the climate has changed in and around the state of Rhode Island, for example. But this type of pattern of losing those dry years and seeing a much wetter state with greater frequency is what we're seeing throughout much of southern New England, parts of eastern New York, and into interior New England. And what it really tells us is that we are raining more. We are seeing an increase in the annual rainfall. In 1930, the state of Rhode Island would average about 43 inches of rain in a given year. Nowadays, we're averaging about 51 inches. That's a remarkable shift. At the same time, we've seen the annual average temperatures in the state increase at about 1 degree every 35 to 40 years. Now, 1 degree Fahrenheit to you and me over the course of a year is hardly noticeable. But if you think of it in terms of climate, over the last 100 years, we've lost a little latitude. Our climate has actually shifted us a little southward. At the same time, the atmosphere and the oceans are responding to this, and we are seeing more moisture in these plumes of tropical moisture that get injected into our storm systems. That's why we're seeing more intense rains, more frequent heavy rain events, and just a wetter state overall. And it's no accident that places like Fall River and New Bedford now are seeing these urban flash floods, because the infrastructure that we developed over the last 50 years was based off the way we used to rain in the 60s, in the 50s, and the 40s. When you've increased your annual precipitation by 7 or 8 inches, and you're dropping it in these real intense events, you wind up with more flooding, more urban flooding, and more flooding on the rivers. So this Palmer Drought Index clearly shows that if you look at these tan shaded bars, these are indicative of dry periods. Each bar is over the course of a year. And the more negative, or the farther down toward the bottom of the graph it is, the more intense the drought. So this one right here is the big 1960s drought that got all the notoriety, where the water supplies are really limited. But since that time, look at the absence of any prolonged or intense dry period. It's basically non-existent. And what have we had? Multiple years of wet to extremely wet conditions. What that means from a soil moisture standpoint, we're wetter. The sponge has got more water in it before the next rain event. For vegetation, look around us. We're having certain species of trees die off, either because of the roots are rotting out, or we're getting insects due to the warmer weather invading species. I'm losing white pines up in the northern part of Cumberland.
Exactly. Plants, anything that surrounds us is really
Insects,
very
everything.
unique
It
to
is.
that particular item.
And it's very sensitive to it, which I don't think we give enough credit to.
No.
The animals, the insects, growing up as a kid, I used to see praying mantises all the time. I don't see praying mantises anymore. I'm seeing walking sticks. What are walking sticks doing on the side of my house in Cumberland, Rhode Island? Never saw those growing up. It's fascinating if you take the time to just sit in your backyard for an afternoon and just look around at what's happening.
You've started to chart this for quite a while now. Is this a normal thing that happens, or do you think something has actually caused this to accelerate so?
That is the million-dollar question.
Okay.
And I approach it this way. As people living in this part of the world, we've really been measuring conditions for a really small snippet of time, maybe 150, maybe 200 years. We've got a couple of sites like the Blue Hill Observatory that go back a long, long way.
Mm-hmm.
But what the science in the research community will tell us is that carbon emissions and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is as high as they've ever witnessed, and it's climbing. And there is an aspect of having more CO2 in the atmosphere and how that changes the way the Earth balances incoming and outgoing radiation that results in warming. I believe that is all factual. What we're witnessing on the ground, though, to me, is part climate change. And yes, there's planetary cycles that we go through over courses of tens of thousands of years. Those aren't going away. Those still exist. But with all of the carbon emissions, I think it's quite likely that maybe we're putting a little bit of a boost on the particular cycle we're in now. It doesn't mean every year is extreme, no. But we are seeing extremes every year in some part of the country with greater frequency. For us here in New England, what I look at is a combination of the changing climate, for whatever reason. I personally don't care necessarily. What concerns me is that we're not designed for it, we're not built for it. And it's not cheap to engineer our way out of where we are. And the where we are is based on building for what we had in the 50s and 60s, but with the reality that we're 8 inches wetter, that we're a couple of degrees warmer, that we're seeing more intense rainfall events, and that the whole background state is so much wetter. So you couple Mother Nature turning the faucets on a little more, with a little more vigor, on top of all of our land use change and urbanization, especially, in that I-95 corridor from Maine back to New York City. That's where we've seen the greatest shift in increased rainfall, but it's also where we've seen probably the most extensive change in the way we use the land. To me, it's an accumulation of all of these intricate pieces that are making for increased flooding, increased stress on the system. You add in the sea level rise, it's stressing out the coastline. It's all complex, it's all together.
So yeah, everything does work together. I myself remember when 95 was non-existent around here. That wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't, when you think about it. There's a graphic that I use in some of my presentations that is so indicative of this culmination of events. If you look at the Patuxent River Basin, the gauging site is at Cranston. Prior to the late 60s, they hardly had but a handful of floods. We urbanized that corridor with shopping malls and businesses and interstates and laid down a lot of pavement during the same time when Mother Nature started raining on us heavier. So do you think it's any accident we're seeing so much more flooding? No, I don't think so. But to blame it all on climate change, I think is not really giving credence to what we've done infrastructure-wise in land use. And the fact that some of this is just a normal cycle, but I do think we're kind of putting a little bit of oomph, as my grandfather would say, a little more oomph onto the state we're in. And like I said, it doesn't mean every year is going to be extreme. Last winter, the winter of 2013-14, was so extreme to so many, only because we haven't been able to sustain that kind of cold for the entire winter. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but what we are living through is that those winters just don't come around as often as they used to.
And everything does change. I've spent a good portion of my life just doing the gardening, landscaping, and you know, I've been taught from the get-go to be a good steward of the land. And that goes all with what you're talking about here.
It does.
And I have to tell you, I feel much safer knowing that you're here monitoring this. And I want to thank you. We're going to move on a little bit because there is so much to see.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now we're in a conference room at the National Weather Service, and I am graced with the presence of Glenn Field. It seems to me there's an awful lot of things in common with the people that are employed at NOAA. How did you become a meteorologist? What inspired you to take this course of action with your life?
Actually, a lot of people in the profession, and in this office in particular, have had a love for meteorology from an early age. And that was true for me, maybe at a really early age. When I was 3 years old, I used to scotch tape the temperature to the door every hour and make my mother come look at it. Sometimes you just have a bug for meteorology. But I have an interesting background because my father was a ship's meteorologist in the Navy, has his master's in meteorology from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And
It's in your blood.
so in real life, he was a chemical engineer. But on the weekends, my parents were divorced, and I would visit him, and he would talk about the weather all the time, and I got very interested. Now, interestingly, my mother was an elementary school music teacher. And so by the time I was in high school, I was singing in the choirs and acting in the plays, and she got me very interested in being in front of people. And now my job is a combination of the two of them. As the warning coordination meteorologist here in Taunton, I'm out interacting with the public, our customers, mariners, aviators, school children, giving presentations quite a bit. And so it's kind of interesting how your career ends up. Climatology is an entirely different profession, where we're looking at months, years ahead. For meteorology is the study of like the next week, maybe out to 10 days. That's about how accurate we can be right now. We try to get day one right. Okay, so we're looking at our numerical models. A lot of experience goes into making a forecast just from having seen how a certain model behaves. Once we start seeing the signal, especially on a lot of models, then it gives us more confidence that something might actually happen. So let's say we're out at day 9 and we see a big storm starting to happen. We'll mention it perhaps when it gets to day 7 in our hazardous weather outlook.
You don't want to alarm people unless you're absolutely
Right.
sure that something is happening.
But what we found is that by day 5, our emergency managers, especially depending on the severity of the storm, really need a lot of heads up. They need to call in, crews from other states, have them pre-positioned so that your power can come back on pretty quickly. Sandbags in the case of flooding. I mean, there's a lot of work that emergency managers do behind the scenes to make it so that responses can be pretty quick. We might mention the storm and the varying degrees on various avenues that we now have on Facebook and Twitter, and our regular internet page.
What's your website here?
Glad you asked. Weather.gov. Remember, that's your government tax dollars. Weather.gov, not weather.com. That's the Weather Channel in Atlanta, and that's a great means of getting our forecast out and our warnings. Our Skywarn spotters are very critical for us, and about a third of those are also ham radio operators. So therefore we have over about 2,000 ham radio operators. Now realistically, I would say only about 400 are really active, but it's hard to know because they only report when something's at their house. And it's different from the Midwest, because in the Midwest you have north, south, east, west roads, and everybody quits their job for the day and goes spotting, and you can see for miles. I guarantee if you're on a New England road and you go more than a half an hour, you've made 100,000 turns and trees in the way, etc. So that's why we need a dense network of spotters. And I would say 90% of the verification of our severe weather comes from the ham radio operators. And they're just a tremendous asset to us. It used to be 10 or 15 years ago that we would call our Eastern Mass coordinator and our Central Mass and our Western Mass and New Hampshire and activate Skywarn when there's bad weather. Now they've organized themselves so well, led by Rob Macedo, who's our main ham coordinator, lives in New Bedford, and one call to him activates it, but usually he's on our what we call NWS chat. That's specifically for emergency managers and our Skywarn coordinators. And they're asking us, what time do you need us in, before we even activate them. And the same thing goes for setting up our Skywarn sessions. We just give them a list of what days we have available, and they get all the schools and all the places for where they're going to be. So just a tremendous help.
How would one engage themselves to be a part of the program?
To be a part of the program, you just go to our website, weather.gov/Boston, and there's a under the program section, there's Skywarn, and we'll have a list come about February or so of where the sessions are going to be for the spring and the early summer, and just go to one. They're free of charge, and prepare for an entertaining session, and then you'll get a Skywarn card with an 800 number that you can call in on and report according to the criteria that you learn at that session. You do have to be 16 years of age or older.
Okay, so once you get that card, you're official.
Right.
Okay.
And we ask for retraining every 5 years.
Okay, I have to thank you. I had a wonderful time today.
Same here.
We part until we meet again. See you next time, here in Emily's Garden. And everything is all housed in this one building.
All in this one building for this part of New England.
You look familiar to me.
Yes.
How do I know you?
Attleboro Rotary Auction.
All right.
Good, Jim.
Okay. So I'm going to continue this with, you know, I have heard so much about the Doppler weather radar, and it's here.
Oh, yes, it's right across the street. Make sure to take a picture of it before you go home.